Breaking news, special counsel Jack Smith is pushing back against Donald Trump's claim of presidential immunity. Smith writes in a new court filing tonight that granting a former president absolute immunity from criminal prosecution, quote, threatens to license presidents to commit crimes to remain in office. So let's discuss this with CNN political commentator and Democratic strategist Maria Cardona and CNN political commentator and Republican strategist Alice Stewart. Thank you for being here with us. I want to start with this new filing from Jack Smith. I had one of Trump's former lawyers, Tim Parlatore, on a short time ago. He said, look, this question of presidential immunity, Trump's not going to win here, but just by appealing this, he may win on his strategy of delaying this trial until after the election. Parlatore told me it's 50-50 whether this trial actually goes before November. Maria, I want to get your take on what happens if Trump does not see the inside of a federal courtroom before the 2024 race.
You know, I think we all knew from the very beginning when Trump and his legal team were trying to do everything to claim immunity, to push back on all of his legal woes, and it would take us an hour to list them all here on this program, Paula. We all knew that his strategy would be to draw this out as long as he could so that none of this actually is something that voters will see him inside a courtroom, to your point. They have seen him inside a courtroom before, and it's not a pretty sight. But I think at the end of the day, even if he is not inside a courtroom, Paula, I think it is degrading and it does hurt Trump going into the 2024 election. Perhaps not the GOP primary. We have seen that almost nothing hurts him there, and that every single thing that goes against him helps him in the GOP primary. But in the general election, it's a completely different story. We already saw that the general public has rejected the MAGA agenda in 2018. They rejected Trump himself in 2020. They don't want the chaos. They don't want the indecency. And he has since even become much more chaotic in terms of what he would do. And the reminder every single time that something happens in the legal aspect of what he's going through reminds voters, independent voters, women voters, those decent voters that don't want to go through another 4 years of trauma to their emotional well-being and their mental well-being, understand that this is not somebody who is fit to have office anymore, especially the highest office in the land, especially when he has already been convicted and has been in trouble in courts, and frankly, somebody who has tried to overturn a fair and free election and destroy our American democracy.
Alice, I want to pose this to you as well. If the former president is not prosecuted in either one of the special counsel's cases this year, what is the impact for his chances in November?
Look, I think that certainly remains to be seen. Look, we've already known and seen that his base is not going anywhere, regardless of how the legal proceedings are played out in court. But the question is, undecided Republican voters or independent voters, they're looking for potentially a reason to turn the page. And there's quite big possibility that if he is convicted of any of these charges, that is the excuse or the permission they need. Look, if I can address this Jack Smith ruling today, look, this helps Donald Trump for 3 reasons. Every time there is a filing, every time he is kicked off a ballot, this helps Donald Trump for 3 reasons. In the Jack Smith case, what this does, this delays the inevitable legal process. This galvanizes Donald Trump's base, and this boosts his fundraising. He probably already has a fundraising email out on this right now, and he uses these, as he does with all of these legal issues, he has lumped them all into one basket, saying that all of these are the same when we know they are not, saying that he is the victim here. This is a weaponization of the Justice Department and legal jeopardy that he has found himself in, and liberal justices, liberal DAs, liberal secretaries of state in Maine are going after him because he is the front runner in this case, in this election. And that is how he is pushing this out there with his base. They buy into it. And this is just another example where he is going to say, I am the victim. And it certainly, as we're seeing, is not hurting his poll numbers and his support so far.
Well, let's pivot to this question of ballot eligibility. He has now been removed in Colorado and Maine. However, both of those decisions are on pause while waiting to see if the Supreme Court weighs in here. Even some of the political rivals like Chris Christie have said that this whole idea that you're removing him from the ballot either through the courts or through elected or appointed officials makes him a martyr. Maria, do you agree?
I do think it makes him a martyr, but he was going to play the martyr regardless, Paula. And look, somebody who tried to overturn a free and fair election, somebody who tried to destroy our American democracy, somebody who has already said in his own words that he will be a dictator on day one. Of course they're not fit for office. Of course they should not be allowed to run for the highest office in the land. Of course they do not show the qualifications that somebody should show to be eligible to run for that highest office in the land. So I'm glad that he's being kicked off of the ballot in all of these states. Will it make a difference? Probably not, because at the end of the day, those states where currently he has been kicked off, and we'll see whether that sticks, whether it goes to the Supreme Court and what they do, are states that normally have been won by the Democrats. So I don't think at the end of the day it will make a difference in terms of the electoral votes. He will absolutely use it to underscore his martyrdom, but he will use anything, Paula, to underscore the martyrdom. And we cannot forget, regardless of whether we think that this could be a political issue that he uses to his advantage, no one is above the law, Paula. No one, even a former president of the United States. This goes to Jack Smith's claim about presidential immunity. It doesn't matter the political implications here. No one is above the law, and that, I think, should be the bottom line from our legal perspective in a system where everything should be looked at in terms of whether you broke the law or not. And he has already broken the law.
I want to interject here for 1 second, though. We do have to clarify in terms of legal process. Facing federal charges, federal prosecution is different from what we're seeing here. And the question that even some of Trump's rivals are raising is whether the assessment of Trump's involvement in insurrection, his fitness for office, if those determinations should be made by state courts and state officials instead of the voters. I mean, don't you think there's any merit to that question?
Here's my take on this. Look, I think Donald Trump was wrong to question the outcome of the election. He was wrong to challenge the certification of the election, and he was wrong in many areas of what he has done to cause people to question whether or not we have free and fair elections. But in regard to an insurrection, he has not been convicted of anything. So we need to take that into account. And when you have Democrats that are always screaming that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy, what a threat to democracy is a liberal Secretary of State who took it upon herself to remove him from the ballot.
Wait a second. She did not take it upon herself. That is the process in the state of Maine. She didn't raise her hand and say, I want to do this. Maine is unique in that the first stop for questions of ballot eligibility is the Secretary of State.
Right, but the voters, most people, even Angus King from Maine, who's an independent, says that that should have been up to the decision of the voters. And then we also have in Colorado liberal justices who made the decision to remove him from the ballot. Again, Donald Trump's challengers are saying, not necessarily in defense of Donald Trump, but we shouldn't have the justice system and secretaries of state unilaterally making the decision to take him off the ballot. This should be in the hands of voters. And doing so any other way, that is a threat to democracy, taking the power of the election process out of the hands of voters and putting it into the justice system.
But let's also remember that in Colorado, it was Republicans who brought this suit. And so, again, I think across the board, what we need to remember here is that no one is above the law. And all of these things have gotten to the point of being in the hands of the court because of processes that started with the democratic system, the democratic process that we should all respect right now. And you know, the one person who doesn't respect our democratic system or our democracy writ large is Donald Trump, who tried to destroy it and has already said he will do so again if he gets another 4 years at the Oval Office. And we should not give him that opportunity.
I will note that in the state of Colorado, the Republican Party in Colorado has filed an appeal to the Supreme Court. Among the questions they're asking the justices to weigh in on is whether their own First Amendment right has been violated, because they believe they have the right to list whoever they want on the primary ballot. But it seems what we can all agree on is We need some clarity from the Supreme Court here, because the 14th Amendment, the process for ballot eligibility, clearly very confusing for multiple states with different outcomes. The best thing for democracy, perhaps a little guidance from the High Court. Alice, Stewart, Maria Cardona, thank you.